Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another one of our Friday privacy chats. I'm joined by Amber Izell. Amber is a member of our AI team and has been a great asset to FPF. Before I hand over to her to talk about the generative AI checklist that she developed with input from a lot of stakeholders. Yes, we didn't do this, I think, last week or even the week before. I have been traveling. We held our first big event in Japan. I think I'll call it the first annual Japan Privacy Symposium. We had 250, 260 people, most of the leading G7 regulators who happened to be in Japan for G7 meetings. We said, hey, let's provide an opportunity for the local corporate global Japanese privacy community to hear directly from the regulators about what the FTC is doing in the US, what the regulators in Italy and the UK and elsewhere are working on, so they can be up to date and savvy about the priority concerns. Some of our team then went on to an AI event that the Korean Data Protection Commissioner was holding in Korea. I flew over to Tel Aviv, where we were running a number of our Cyber Week activities, including hosting a meeting of our group of DPA senior staff who focus on pets. And then 2 weeks of vacation in beautiful Argentina. So apologies for playing hooky a little bit and missing a couple of Fridays, but we're going to bring you up to date. And of course, we're going to talk about generative AI because that's what's taking everybody's time and attention nowadays. I think as we pay closer and closer attention, we learn that some of the issues aren't new. They're ones that organizations have been dealing with for a long time. And then there are indeed new issues that are creating a frenzy of activity. Amber, you and the team posted a really valuable, we've had such great feedback, checklist of the kinds of policies that organizations should have. Some organizations perhaps have long had some of these practices in place, right? Don't post our customers' personal information out on the web. Don't provide it to third-party services that sell it or do other stuff with it. And then there were a lot of new issues as well. Can you walk us through the process? How did this come to be? And then we'll jump into the substance of the document.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the checklist because it feels like it's been a long time coming, and I'm glad that we could finally put it out for public consumption. So yeah, back in the spring, maybe around like March or so, we started having conversations with a few companies that were they were wondering how to wrap their minds around some of the issues that they've noticed in terms of their employees using ChatGPT. And I think by this time everybody's familiar with ChatGPT. How could you not be at this point? But it was really right before it started hitting the news a lot. But they noticed that there were wide ranges of use that their employees were using it for, but also, that concern, not just for how this can, change the workforce, but also, how to make sure that they're managing employee use of ChatGPT and other generative AI tools to make sure that they're protecting their company data, making sure that they're complying with the law in terms of how the data is being managed and used, but then also making sure that employees understand the implications of that. And so we started out with a set of conversations with companies. It was really a roundtable style where everyone was really sharing some of their experiences in terms of anticipated uses and also current ways that employees were using generative AI tools, and then sharing whether they had developed policies already. There was a really wide range in terms of some people were kind of like, "What's ChatGPT?" Again, because this was early in the spring. And then others had already developed really robust generative AI policies, but they were wondering, how do we fill in the gaps? What should we even be thinking about? And so this project really came as a resource to fill in that gap, making sure that companies that had not yet developed policies kind of had a starting point in terms of what should they be thinking about when they're developing internal policies for generative AI tools. But then for companies that had already developed these tools, how do they make sure that they're covering their bases? And so as a caveat, this checklist isn't, meant to substitute for due diligence. It's really important to, especially because AI and especially the generative AI space is really rapidly developing. And since there isn't, comprehensive AI legislation yet, it's really important to keep abreast of where the law is going and where regulatory agencies are. So this isn't meant to be like an end all be all, like here's all the things that you have to do to make sure you're complying with the law, but really, here are some considerations that you should be thinking about. So that's really how this came about, and really wanted to provide like practical steps that people can implement so that they can figure out how to wrap their minds around this.
Yeah, so obviously GDPR compliance, CCPA compliance, state legislative compliance, compliance with anti-discrimination laws. There's a wide range of areas where when a new project starts, organizations know that you need to go through maybe a privacy impact assessment, a GDPR compliance review, other issues. And our goal here wasn't to do that privacy impact assessment for people because, number one, there are issues that are far beyond those particular privacy reviews that are captured. And second, what's different about, I think, what happened with the launch of ChatGPT and many typical product development things at organizations is, somebody knows, most reasonable employees understand that if I'm starting a new project and it's going to use data, I've got to go through a process, right? I've got to get approval to use servers. I've got to go through legal. I've got to talk about privacy. And a responsible organization has a work process to vet issues. I think what happened here, which was sort of shocking or bracing for a lot of folks, right, is all of a sudden there was this, consumer accessible tool on the web that used data, that collected data, that was free. Free means your data is the product, right? And many employees who certainly, if they were, engineers working on a new project, might have gone through the typical review process, but who may have simply been, hey, I've got notes from all of my meetings. Oh, hey, we have, information about our emailing and the responses to our emails. I just want to use this new tool to summarize it, to organize it, to write a draft for me. And in many cases, that's not where you sit down and say, call legal, call privacy, let's have a privacy impact assessment. And those, I think, the consumerization, the democratization of AI, right? That's where companies have to have internal employee-focused policies that help remind employees what tools they're allowed to use, what they're allowed to do with, with data, how they're supposed to conduct themselves. And that's really what this does. I think it's cognizant, and we'll jump into this now, of flagging that there may be certainly data protection issues. But frankly, there also might be employment discrimination issues. If you work in HR and you're organizing the resumes that are in your file, and not even sharing data, but you're using it somehow to categorize and rank and so on and so forth, there might be issues. So let's indeed jump in and walk us through how you organized this under a couple of sort of high-level categories, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, no, thanks. First, yeah, to the point of, the democratization, of these AI tools, I think that that is what is the most, startling and also one of the most, difficult things to manage because, I know for me personally, when, more people were starting to use ChatGPT, for their work tasks, it was all over social media. I know, like, I saw so many posts, like, down my, LinkedIn feed about 10 ways to streamline your work using ChatGPT. And of course, like, you see that and you're like, well, I want to do my job better, I want to do my job faster. And even if you haven't already heard of ChatGPT, you see your coworker using it and you're like, what are you doing, how'd you do that so fast? And so I think that that's what makes this, like, correctly pointed out, very unique, in that employees are always looking for ways to, make their lives easier. And, making sure though at the same time, like you said, like even though this is a tool that promises, it's great. It's really, really great. But there are definitely risks associated with it that, the average employee, might not think about. People see this promise of what a tool can do and might not think about, some of the risks associated with it. They think about the benefits, and there are a lot of benefits, but just really bridging that gap. And so, with that being said, that was really, the process that we went through to organize the checklist, like really listening to, the concerns, of the organizations that we talked to, in terms of like what issues were keeping them up at night. And so, yeah, the checklist is broken down into four major parts. The first being, making sure that generative AI tools are being used in compliance with, existing laws. And policies for data protection and security. The second being, employee training and, education. The third being employee use disclosure. So how, whether or not someone is going to disclose that they generated, or they produce something using generative AI. And then lastly, as you said, with issues of discrimination and other potential, implications of the use of generative AI, we wanted to also look at the outputs, of generative AI and making sure that you have the infrastructure in place to check the outputs.
We're following the comments, and if there's anything that you've done in your organization that you can share that you think has been helpful or useful, I know people watching will appreciate. Emily Barwell points out that at their org they have a just-in-time notice that pops up if somebody uses a free AI tool reminding users about the work policy and the like. And we've, I think, heard a lot of that. We've heard, I think, a pretty big range. Um, we've heard of companies that are blocking access to those tools. Typically, they've got an alternative to offer. Maybe they have a enterprise contract with Microsoft or with one of the providers who are providing a cloud based, subject to confidentiality and other restrictions. And so they may point them over there. Others are doing something similar to what Emily flagged, triggering a warning and a reminder. Um, uh, in the first of the key points, you flag, use in compliance with existing laws and policies for data protection and security. And that sounds like sort of a, you know, pat, like follow the laws, but or follow our policies. But it's actually dead on, because not every employee thinks every day, oh, there is a policy about which tools I can use. They use the tools that they've been provided, and I think we found a lot of organizations taking a look and saying, oh, we have a policy that says don't load customer information into some random third party interface that we have no contractual relationship with, right? And that kind of makes sense, but it's not the kind of thing that maybe somebody sitting doing some administrative work thinks of. So it's for some companies, that education moment, saying, hey, we got that, actually that's our policy doesn't let you do that already. But right now, pay attention, to that. And then obviously other folks maybe didn't have that level of detail, or needed to, update it. You flag that privacy policies, data use policies, information classification, terms of service. Good time to make sure, especially if you're a smaller organization, that it's not just your external privacy policy. A lot of organizations, certainly less mature ones, think they're done when they post their privacy policy. But actually having that internal policy written for your employees that maps to ensure that they're following the policy, right? Simply saying, read our privacy policy, and hoping that they'll understand that, especially when that's been written very often so legalistically, with such, complication. And I don't blame the writers. If you're writing a privacy policy and you want to be GDPR compliant, you're going to be listing legitimate interest and consent and contractual basis. Doesn't necessarily help an employee who's looking to use a tool to know that we've declared that the reason we are able to do this with consumer data is based on legitimate interest. You need to know, hey, um, you may use this tool because we've got a legal basis in place, but we also made commitments and make sure that you and your use support our ability to live up um, to those commitments. You flag some of the key points that need to be in those new enterprise contracts that have started bubbling up, right? I think the big difference was that when we first um, started, it really was just the reaction to ChatGPT and the consumerization, right? And now I think we're seeing more mature organizations focused on using these tools under contractual arrangements, but that's still fairly new. On one hand, you're trusting your cloud provider for hosting a lot of data, but we know people have started scrutinizing those contracts to ensure that the uses of data are in compliance with their obligations as well. And certainly this, where there is sometimes an expectation that product improvement can be part of the process, ensuring that that doesn't reveal any of your confidential data is certainly a big part of it. What else should we flag that is useful? You flagged employee training and education.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a big part of the piece really because um like we mentioned before that because this is a tool that can be in the hands of, everyday employees, it's really, imperative to make sure that that employees are trained well. And one of the issues actually that came up in our earlier conversations was that like who makes the training? Like who's responsible for developing that? And I think that that's still a question that remains answered because part and parcel of that training is making sure that somebody at your organization understands generative AI tools, for example, and how it works, who really has ownership of that. And I think one of the biggest aspects of this checklist is that it really promotes collaboration across an organization, and that's really a theme that came up a lot through this entire process. So collaboration, at a macro level, in terms of how the checklist was even developed, making sure that it wasn't developed in a vacuum. It wasn't just something that that I thought of. But really it came from these major themes that we saw across companies and their observations as well. But also, a lot like facilitating that information sharing. Some organizations actually shared their generative AI policies with us as well. So it was really helpful to see kind of, at a smaller level, what are companies thinking about? But then also at a more micro level, promoting collaboration across an organization. And one of the issues that we've seen is that chief privacy officers now, they're not just, privacy people, they're also AI people now, and they've been tasked with, really figuring out AI governance. And so one of the things that I was hoping to do with that piece is just really streamlining the process a little bit and providing these considerations, so that the onus doesn't just fall on one person at an organization, but making sure that you can anticipate, what types of employees are going to be using these tools. How are they going to be using them? Making sure that it's not just the privacy folks, it's not just the compliance folks that are at the table, but it's also the software developers, because they have different uses for generative AI tools than, the HR manager, for example. And so making sure that employees at different levels and different job functions understand how generative AI might be used in their particular job function, and making sure that you can anticipate and educate employees on some best practices and what kind of considerations they should think of when they're using these tools.
I've been hosting some peer-to-peer meetings with organizations in a number of cities, and it's been a pretty wide range in terms of who's been the sort of chief of coordinating the coordination that you flagged is needed. There were certainly some companies where the chief privacy officer stepped up and said, "It's me, because who better than me?" Or it seems to be falling on me. And so they were the ones looping in IP, looping in um, domains beyond their direct scope. But there were others who said, I talked to one very large non-consumer facing technology infrastructure company, and that CPO said, "I'm pretty busy. I got state laws, I got international laws, I got international data flows. I'm pretty busy. Some of this is mine. I'm doing the privacy review. Some of this is not mine." And in that organization, the CISO, who had engineering capacity, was sort of chairing the effort, and privacy was just one of multiple stakeholders around the table. So, and then we've seen, I think, everything in between, right? Privacy being the lead, being part of it, being broad, and I think we will. And look, maybe different organizations will go, in different directions just based on their. Do they have a senior privacy lead who really understands data? Mastercard has been making folks who grew up in privacy or were CPO, their chief data officers, right? So they appreciate that. Very often, the privacy folks are the ones, because of the kind of work they're doing, that know where all the data is and are thoughtful about thinking about risk. Other organizations, that's just not, where that more legal focused reviewer goes. You mentioned in the employee training and education, in particular, developers and data scientists who are using, maybe Microsoft Copilot, GitHub, these other programming tools. We just had a call again with some of the privacy leads who were really focused on the fact that engineering teams are using some of the code writing capability, and in addition to all the privacy issues, obviously. These are tools that were built off other people's code, right? So it's not just a matter of, oh, did the um, transformer and the reinforcement learning get trained on all of the public facing data in the world? And, there are obviously some yet to be fully resolved legal issues there. But more specifically, if you're using code that maybe had to have an open source license, right? Or maybe was contributed with restrictions on commercial use. And so, particular, I think, some complexity around using some of those tools, given the way that the code sometimes gets contributed back to the database. You Taking a look at some of the other key points, employee use disclosure. Do you want to say a bit more about that section and some of the key points that you flagged there?
Yeah, sure. So this one, I was really thinking about, there's really an interesting dynamic in terms of, whether employees are even going to disclose that they used a generative AI tool to develop their work product. I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of people that probably wouldn't want to admit that they were able to get their uh, policy or whatever their job might be, code, like we were just talking about, that they use generative AI, because, there's a in some ways there could be a stigma associated with it, like that maybe you aren't as brilliant as you thought, or as you were previously thought to be. But really one thing that I really wanted to think about and really highlight is that um, it's really important for companies to address it, whether or not employees are going to disclose that they're gonna use generative AI tools. It's important to at least, talk about it and give them infrastructure, where they can, disclose it. And, we talked earlier about how there's different, forms of generative AI policies. Some companies have, had outright bans on generative AI tools. Others have more restrictive use, and then others, kind of have more of an open an open use and don't have policies yet. But for those that do have more restrictive use of generative AI, one thing that I've seen is that they require employees to request whether they're going to use generative AI. So they're being, forthright about whether they're going to be using generative AI, and providing information about why they're going to use it. And that really helps companies, organizations keep track of how it's being used, just making sure that there's like a paper trail, if you will. Like if there is an issue that happens more downstream in terms of, if there's something inaccurate that came out in one of the outputs, and maybe it was missed, so that it really provides that accountability, so that you can point and say like, "Oh, okay, this section was drafted by ChatGPT and maybe we missed something." So it really provides protection for the employee, because you can, not saying that using oh, ChatGPT made me do it isn't an excuse, but helping them identify like, oh, this is where things might have gone wrong. But then also making sure that companies can point to how employees are using it, so that they can provide that support as well. And so just making sure that there's infrastructure in place so that it can be documented and tracked, just in case something does happen downstream.
Increasingly, we see really strong reports on how people who are using these tools on their own accurate data. I was talking to an organization the other day that has a very robust conflict of interest policy, and employees are asking questions like, we use a trucking company in this foreign country, and they sent me a birthday cake. Can I keep it? Right? They sent me a gold watch. Can I keep it? Um, they've offered me a discount on something, and employees go to the conflict of interest area in the internal network, and they search for an answer, and they get whatever they get. And they have a vast amount of FAQs and policy information. Well, they've trained a generative AI tool on their corpus of conflict of interest laws, conflict of interest guidance, sample cases, and it is working, they say, incredibly well. Incredibly well. Like it's really good guidance based on this, well vetted, reliable set of information. So that's wonderful. But that also means that employees can get sloppy because it's working so well here, but that's a very structured, use case that's been vetted and tested, and then get comfortable, using it in other areas where they're going to miss that. On the code generation side as well, most organizations have sort of practices. These, giant um, programs are incredibly complex, and there are documentation requirements so that if something's going wrong, if there's a security issue, if there's a an IP issue, the developer has provided some trail. Well, I took this from this database of code here that is widely used, right? Developers use a vast amount of open source stuff, but you got to keep track. Well, what happens when the entire program, right, was written by a third-party tool, ensuring that you're handling the appropriate documentation. We have just a short time left. You had an op-ed in, was it The Hill? Which one of in The Hill, together with Amy Stepanovich, our head of U.S. policy yesterday, focused on not internal, company use, but the way our governments and politicians and candidates are likely to be using these tools going forward. Can you give a little snapshot, and we'll post a link to that just so people know what you're doing in the broader policy sphere?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jules. So generative AI obviously has a lot of differing uses. It's not just being used in the employee space, but also to generate campaign ads and other materials. We've seen that regulators are also using it to, draft legislation as well. And so there's varying uses, but it's really important, because it's becoming more and more difficult to identify when something's created using generative AI. It's really important for us to be alert and make sure that we're more literate, I guess, in terms of how we take in information and understanding the risks associated with generative AI. I know we don't have much time, so I would encourage everybody to go read the article on the Hill, and excited to continue to see how it's being used in different ways, and but also making sure that we understand the implications and how it can have an impact on politics and even the way that we think about what is truth and what's not. So, yeah.
Generative AI could be used to steal the next election. Here's how we can stop it. So please do read. Amber, thanks for this useful document. We don't suggest that anybody take the entire document and put this up. Hopefully you already have some of these in your policies. There are pieces here that are sort of duplicated because we're trying to raise it in each section. You may want to just state it, one time. This hopefully provides a range of things that many stakeholders flag that they think are needed, that they've got. And so you can go ahead and look at your policy if you have one. And if there's something flagged here that's not in yours, maybe that's fine because it's not relevant to you, or you made a decision that you handled elsewhere, but it might spark something that you might want to include. So super useful tool. I'm glad that we made it public. We spent a lot of time working on some practical best practices and so forth for stakeholders that are interested. We sometimes will publish that more broadly because we want to make sure that it's available to the broader community, and I'm glad we were able to do that here. Thank you for joining me and the amazing work that you do with the rest of the FPF team who were involved and supportive. And as always, Nancy and Payal, our comms folks, who are in the background making sure everything goes smoothly. Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks to those who listened in, joined us. Do continue the conversation. If there's a interesting point or a question that you want to flag, we'll be keeping an eye on the comments, and I will be talking to many of you in upcoming Fridays. Reminder that we've got training for you individually or for your organization. If you'd like us to come on in, do sign up. We've got a real expert group of trainers, people who've worked in day-to-day AI development, people who worked in day-to-day compliance at organizations that have been working on AI for a long time. So do take advantage of the very affordable training courses that we provide. Thanks all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.